The following is a conversation with Flora Roumpani. I got in contact with Flora in context of the City Engine support I managed many years back, and later with multiple presentations she gave at the City Engine user meetings I organized. After getting her master's and PhD degrees, Flora stayed in academia for multiple years as a researcher and lecturer in multiple positions and fields. More and more now, Flora is shifting her work towards collaborations between academia, government entities, and companies in the industry. She has developed multiple scientific methods to scientifically analyze urban data, visualize it, and develop design scenarios in both small and large scales. Now, Flora is a very smart cookie, but don't be fooled. She's also a little bit of a lawless creature. Because when we met in London and visited the Tate Modern, it was actually her idea that we should sneak into the restricted exhibition section with more artworks. Well, we did not get caught. So stay humble and stay curious. This is the 3D Environment podcast. And now, please enjoy the conversation with Flora Roumpani. Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much, Flora, for taking the time for this, you could say, anniversary or 10 kind of anniversary episode number 10. Welcome.
Amazing. Thank you for having me. Very happy that I'm the 10th episode of this series. Looking forward to the interview.
This is like the VIP position already here.
that's very, that's an honor, but also creates a bit of pressure.
Yes, it is. Sweet. Well, cool. So I would say let's just start with a little bit of your background. And so please tell us a bit about who you are and in general, where you're coming from.
So my name is Flora. I'm an urban planning professional and researcher, specializing, I would say, probably in smart cities and digital transformation. I always feel like I get an existential crisis when I try to answer this question, because I think nowadays everybody does quite a lot of different things. I've also kind of changed quite a lot, especially coming from an academic background and going to the industry. So I'm currently a senior consultant in cities at Borough Happold in London, where I lead the development of kind of innovative urban planning solutions, including like digital twins and platforms with AI and so on. But I'm also teaching a few master modules and master course in the Royal College of Art in the UK. Yeah, but my background is in architecture, and I also got a PhD from UCL a while ago.
Very impressive. Well, awesome.
Thank you.
So kind of looking back into your career or in general, the decision, what was your personal motivation to go, first of all, kind of for architecture and urban planning, and then for a PhD, and then obviously also the further academic career, like a postdoc direction? And why did you choose kind of to go in this direction versus just going for a classic job in the industry?
Yeah, so I was originally aiming at a classic job at the industry, but things got kind of, life brings it. I ended up having a lot of different directions. So for architecture, I think, so I always wanted to do something with art, and I was pretty good as a painter. And I think a lot of the people of my generation, when they wanted to do something in art, either they would just go and study art, or they would actually think about, your parents would actually tell you, well, you need to go to a profession that actually makes money. So one of the professions that at the time was considered to be profitable, but at the same time slightly artistic, was architecture. And I was like, okay, I'll probably join architecture. That was my motivation at the time. I didn't actually have a passion for buildings, but in the course of things, I actually developed quite a lot of passion for cities, and especially about the future of the city. I think this is what drives me to have a career on this field specifically, and also look at the digitization of cities and the future, and then kind of like whatever is happening in the new technologies at the moment in the field. Like, for example, a project that really excites me at the moment, and that in my team we have worked a little bit on it, was the line project in Neom. I don't know if you've probably heard about it, right?
It got just recently shortened by quite a lot.
Well, I heard about that. Yeah, it's but apparently, yeah, they're not certain yet, so they're not really sure whether it is going to get shortened, whether they are going to go ahead with it. It's a very controversial project. For those who don't know about it, the line is like this super ambitious and revolutionary urban development within the NEOM, which is the Saudi Arabia initiative. It's a linear city, which is designed to stretch, I think, over 170 kilometers. And it's housing around, it's supposed to house around 9 million residents. But at the same time, it's designed to run on 100% renewable energy. And this project represents like a very bold vision for the future of the city and urban living, integrating like advanced technology, AI, sustainable practices to create this high-density, car-free environment. And it also follows the 15-minute city kind of rules it's supposed to be following. But obviously, it's highly controversial because it's supposed to be like this super extended skyscraper, which extends from the start of one start of Saudi Arabia and extends all the way to the other. And it's like a line that goes through the desert. Yeah, I find this very exciting.
It's incredibly ambitious and enormous amounts of challenges. Also, from what I've heard, is they have a lot of desert and rocks there, specifically in that region, and a lot of salt water and a lot of sun. But that's basically the only thing that is there. But in general, to go in and use the location and try to build something out of nothing is the ambition. I kind of like the ambition. Just to say, yeah, no, let's actually doing it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's maybe it's over ambitious. I don't know, but we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, I totally find it very controversial. I also like it a lot. I like the idea of trying to create something that has never been done before, even as an experiment. And it has actually, if you think about it, it has been done before. Another example is Las Vegas. Which was firstly developed in the early 20th century. And it was a similar, like a very ambitious venture in the middle of the desert. It started as a small railroad town, and then it became to this huge entertainment city. And even though a lot of people will say it was a failure, like they also say about this project as well, there were a lot of lessons learned from it. And there's a book by Rem Koolhaas, Learning from Las Vegas, which kind of offers this reflections on how Las Vegas was super pioneering and embraced the consumeristic culture and how it did and what kind of the lessons we learned from it.
So you would say, or I mean, you mentioned before, kind of architecture wasn't necessarily per se, or let's say individual, your first choice of interest at the beginning, but because it has these sides of science and art and design and everything combined, but then it feels to me like you loved to kind of move beyond from the individual building, from individual architecture into the urban space. Can you maybe describe, or when did you start to realize this, that, hey, there's much more beyond, let's say, architecture, kind of the whole field of urban planning? When did you start to realize this?
Well, I think it was because in my department back in Patras, where I studied, it's a university in the third biggest city in Greece, did a really good job in creating courses for both architecture and urban design. And I tended to choose the ones that are more urban-related projects. And I think one of the reasons, it's a bit silly reason why I actually went there, but to this direction, But it was because when I was very young, I went to Disneyland. And I was fascinated with how they've developed this. Well, just to clarify, it was in Euro Disney, so in Disneyland in France. And I started noticing that this is an entirely designed, kind of almost like a fake city, that even though it's fake, it has a lot of elements that could contribute to, if they were applied in our city or the place that we live, they would actually make a really nice environment to live in. And I started noticing these elements, such as like the optical magnets. So wherever you go, there's something that orients you, or like the way that the vegetation is being planted around the area. Different elements like that, even down to the way that they design their trash cans. So if you've ever been there, you may notice that each trash can in each, particular area in Disneyland has like a very particular design. It's very well taken care of. And all these kind of little urban elements excite me a lot. And then when I started to travel to other cities, I started noticing more stuff and then starting being more fascinated about how urban urban areas are designed and what does that mean for our future living. So that's how I got into it, I think. And purely, I think, more from a design perspective than what I'm working on at the time, which is more technical.
It's actually very similar. I just remembered also that when I was young or a little kid, I was probably 6 or 7 years old, where on a Sunday I watched a documentary about an architect on TV, and there was Mario Bottas, a quite famous Swiss architect. And I was super fascinated that they were actually designing this. So he was famous for designing churches, but in this particular project that they presented, he was actually tasked to design quite a large graveyards, I believe. And the whole concept of all of the design was basically a train. So basically the last train that you take. And as a kid, I was super fascinated by that, in the sense of also exactly what you just described, is there are people that are designing these places. And I thought, well, wow, this is cool. This is something I could see myself eventually later on do kind of professionally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to contribute to how people live, basically. It's just is what it is.
So now, after you studied architecture and then continued on to go and get your PhD, what was the most important thing that you learned during your PhD? And also, maybe on the other side, also for people considering going for a PhD, what is a detail that nobody tells you beforehand?
Oh, God. I wish we had more time to have a full discussion on this topic. It's a question I get a lot from people who are in my industry and they want to do a PhD. So they all ask me this question: should I do it? Should I not do it? What should I be careful of? I mean, I think nowadays a PhD is not as useful as it was back in the day. And the reason is because unless you actually want to be in academia, is not really valued in the same way, because knowledge can come from other aspects and you can prove your ability to create your own thing in a number of different ways. So it's not anymore considered something that is prestigious, that prestigious as it used to be.
But would you say this is true in general, or just at the moment specifically for, let's say, for architecture?
That's a good question. Yeah, no, it's definitely varies. But I would say, considering a couple of discussions that I had with professionals from both academia and the industry, I think it's probably true in all sectors at the moment. For example, I know that even some academic institutions at the moment don't necessarily hire lecturers that have a PhD. So you may be able to get even a job in academia without a PhD. And they're definitely in the industry is much less valuable in terms of landing a good job or something like that. I would advise people who are thinking about doing a PhD to only do it if they are very, very passionate about something that they themselves want to research, and also to ensure that they are in an environment that supports them to finish this PhD successfully. Yeah, there is a sort of a good environment around them to kind of help them. Because otherwise, I think it is a very painful experience, and it is a kind of a rite of passage, not just because of the work involved, but because of the whole academic environment at the moment. So yeah, that would be my advice.
So yeah, you just mentioned it's painful. I mean, it's not supposed to be easy, right? But I mean, from what I heard from other people that went through the whole thing is that they said the main thing that they learned was basically to deal with bureaucracy and manage and problem solve, basically, but more actually on the administrative side than actually doing research on that side. So this is why I implied the kind of what's the detail that nobody tells you beforehand. I kind of implied it in the question there a little bit, that there's not only the good stuff, but what's your take on this?
So I think when I did my PhD, I was lucky and I didn't have that much bureaucracy. It's true. One of the reasons, after I finished my PhD, I briefly also joined academia as a lecturer in a university. And that's where I faced bureaucracy quite a lot. And that's when I started considering also leaving academia, because I realized that even though that academia has this reputation of allowing you to fix your own schedule and being flexible and so on, it wasn't really that flexible. There's a lot of work, and because of the bureaucracy introduced, there's even more work. There's a lot of protocols that need to be kept and kind of make records of things, and that creates even more work. And in the end, I felt that it was more restricting in allowing me to do my own research than actually the industry, which is confusing, but that's how I experienced it. I'm pretty sure, and I think I was in a university that was actually the teaching load was not that large. And even so, I did feel that I faced some roadblocks. Having said that, I think it depends on different institutions. So yeah, in terms of a PhD, theoretically, you shouldn't be having a lot of bureaucracy. But yeah, nowadays I think that, it's true that it's becoming increasingly, they're adding new and new regulations and things like GDPR and different types of documents that you need to fill in that don't relate to your research and add a lot of workload. So that's also an issue.
I see. All right. But so in general, now regarding your current professional focus, which is in bridging between the industry and academia and working on things that are related to 3D cities and digital twins. Can you elaborate a little bit on the interaction between the two entities? So kind of that's between academia and the industry, and how that started to manifest, or how they got to do, let's say, work together in general, or kind of give me some examples, and then later on how you got involved in kind of working in this intersection.
Yeah, so to be honest, I'm still trying to figure it out, how it works. They are two different worlds in a way. So the reason that I'm working between industry and academia is because, it was my life journey that led me to this. And that's because when I did my master course in the Center of Advanced Spatial Analysis in CAS at the time, I was aiming to just go to the industry. Instead, I was lucky to be offered a PhD. I decided to take that opportunity. I somehow ended up liking the idea of developing my own research and doing research instead of working on these areas. And I decided to try that route. Some things didn't work out the way I wanted them to, so I kind of switched back to industry. But I think that there are definitely people in academia that I really want to work with and that I'm working with. And there are projects that can be done that link the research and development that's happening in industry and the academic research. And this is where the bridges can work really well, is when both areas, so when academia works on the innovation, but not on practical development, and the industry is trying to apply this research in the practical projects, the real world projects with clients and real constraints.
I see. So, but how would you say how are these projects typically funded? Or are they projects that are just kind of more pure collaborations, or are they typically projects that need some sort of funding?
So again, that varies. They're projects without funding. So they're just collaborations that we endeavor in, and the organization support us to do that. One of these projects is the AI and Arts Interest Group that we're running at the Alan Turing Institute. So that's kind of like an engagement/collaboration group that people that are interested in AI and arts can apply for. And we provide a platform for collaboration and engagement and some events. And that's not a paid project. It's just supported by the organization. They're giving us all the equipment or anything that we may need to support the events. Then there are projects that are funded by research institutions. So there are collaborative projects such as UKRI or Innovate UK that you can apply for projects. And there you can actually collaborate with academic partners and industry partners and develop like a joint projects. And then there are projects which are funded by clients who want to develop something. Or you have a product and you can actually work with them on a more research context. So they may want to test something, or they may want to kind of go in a direction that's a bit new. And then you kind of create this kind of research environment and bring in collaborators from the research field that have the specialization that it requires. There are a couple of different ways of doing that.
So anything goes, basically. But I mean, it's really interesting to see and kind of, just talk a little bit in general about those structures, because probably a lot of people listening to the podcast have no idea about the dynamics there, especially kind of the business and how this knowledge is generated, how people meet each other, so and how projects like that, for example, are funded. So there are lots of things that are just really interesting to know how the system works, basically, right?
Yeah, it's a multivariable system. It hugely depends on it's like similarly to any other industry, and onto what kind of product or idea you have and whether people are interested in it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That makes sense. Now, I've seen something when I was doing some business in Gothenburg, Sweden. They have actually this very, very interesting collaboration between the industry, academia, and the government, which is called the Triple Helix, and they have basically a science park that is kind of co-funded by all of these entities, and they have a lot of workshops and even companies that are kind of working in this research location, and it's really connecting everybody. So, for example, Volvo obviously is very, very strong in Gothenburg or in Sweden, and so there's a lot of research going on from the academic side together directly with automotive industry, and so on and so on. And obviously also on the government side, where I was involved with the city administration of Gothenburg, on the urban planning side, the digital twin of the city, the historic reconstructions, and so on. So with this combination or the connection between industry, academia, and government agencies, in your experience, whether in Greece or let's say in the UK, where do you see some bottlenecks that should be resolved that could even potentially result in some business opportunities?
That's a very interesting question. By the way, I remember your project with Gothenburg. That was a very beautiful 3D digital twin that your company developed I remember that it contained a lot of historical information, as you said, like the government was involved. Very, 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 very beautiful
Thank you.
concept.
Thank
So
you.
I'm assuming you I'm assuming you may have run into kind of similar bottlenecks there. I mean, in my particular field and what we're doing, one of the serious issues that we have is the lack of data, which I think a lot of organizations face when they're trying to make this kind of project. So there is the will, there is the excitement in doing projects that involve academia, that involve governmental factors, that involve the industry in doing something massive and big with a vision and so on. But yeah, there is a serious lack of data in the urban environment, and I think that a lot of people in the field are trying to find solutions now to get over that. Not only there's a lack of data, but even the data that exist require a lot of processing, a lot of cleanup. And in our field, in the 3D build environment, I think because we need to create things that also have a lot of detail and they need to be accurate, I think it's one of the most, interestingly, is a serious roadblock. I don't know what's your experience about that.
I think that's a really, really important point. So in general, lack of data, but also then the cleanliness of the data. I think that's obviously something that is a huge challenge, especially if you look at, for example, geographic data and the attribution and all of those things. But then also specifically in the combination or in the communication between, for example, government agencies and academia. So let's say, for example, a local planning authority and academia. I think that link is not too difficult just because they're using similar tools. But then other links between the agencies or between these different entities, they may completely use different tools, different workflows, and not even have dealt with the types of data. So kind of the accessibility of the other's type of data and being able to process them, that in itself I also see as a huge challenge.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think you're very right. Yeah, there are some cases where there are some similar workflows that this can. But do you reckon that there is also maybe a lack of how can I say this? There's a different language between the different organizations that creates a problem in communication?
I would say definitely yes.
Yeah, I agree. I've encountered that as well. And it's not just between the different organizations, academia, industry, and the government, but also between different specializations. So I would say engineers have a very specific language, and their designers also that have a very specific language. And that creates like a huge barrier between for collaborations and things like, I don't know, expanding horizons.
Yeah, but I mean, it's so interesting looking at something like a city or city planning in general. The industry there being, for example, the actual architecture offices and the planning, the urban planning design studios and all of those, working together with the government to, and I don't know, updating the laws and policies and just checking whether a certain design is actually good and can be built, and kind of the whole master planning phase. There's this friction that I've seen for such a long time, and just trying to think about it, it's such a hard problem. It's such a hard problem to streamline those processes. And so I would say there are clearly bottlenecks, and there are probably a myriad of those. But because of that, I would say there's still some business opportunities for that, right?
Yeah, I think so. There definitely are. Yeah, there are definitely some openings for creating businesses that do this kind of translation. Always, it's pretty much a translation between the different parties.
So, one example which I just remembered from one of your last presentations is this, and maybe this is an example that we can dive into, and I'm not perfectly sure if you can talk about it, but I think you did, or you can, because it was a public presentation. The whole research which you were doing that involved AI and kind of analyzing of plans.
Oh yeah, right, yeah.
Right. So just even trying to find my words in, there's so many challenges, and what would be the answer? Well, the answer is just AI, right? It's not that simple, but I just was thinking about this example. So maybe you can give us a little bit of a glimpse into this. So kind of a concrete application of something that you were working on, kind of working also on these types of, let's say, bottlenecks.
Oh, yeah, sure. Just to give context to this, the project is about getting planning applications from the UK, trying to use AI to read these planning applications and extract meaningful information relating to metadata, but also, like, for example, reading drawings and plans and using AI, trying to recreate them, vectorize them, and see if we can actually create 3D out of these plans. This is a project that initially started as a hackathon almost from the Alan Turing Institute and a company at the time that's called Agile Company. We developed a paper from it, which is online. You can find it. It's available. And I think it's called Automating the UK's Planning System. And the goal at the time was to read those planning applications to automatically detect errors on them, because as people submit planning applications in order to do extensions on their houses or add a tree or create a new building, anything that has to do with some kind of intervention in the city environment, these applications a lot of the time don't get approved. And one of the reasons they don't get approved is because they have mistakes, such as they have forgotten things in their drawings or they haven't written something properly. So the goal of this hackathon was to kind of detect automatically these errors. On the next level is about reading them and looking into the information that these applications can give us. And also, if we look at the historical wealth of planning applications of London, for example, we can get like this whole historical evolution of London, of how these, what are the approved projects and how these have been constructed over the years. And this is a project I'm still working on. And I'm trying, as you said, to kind of bring in academia, bring in research institutions such as the Alan Turing Institute and my current industry, and also look at it from a slightly interpretorial kind of point of view, if I'm to say that, even though I'm not in that field at all. But it is a very large project. And there's certainly, I definitely have issues trying to get people to collaborate effectively on projects such as this. So one of the issues is, for example, is how do we get funding for this project? Do we apply for a research grant? Mm-hmm. Do we find a client who are interested in that? Do we get funding from the councils themselves? Do we run this as an internal research project to see to kind of set out the basic things and then kind of spread it out? So these are questions that even now have not been quite answered yet. I'm looking at multiple different routes to this project. Yeah, and it's a matter of kind of seeing what would be the best way of initiating this so that it has the maximum possible impact, so that it kind of has a problem that needs to be solved, so that like the right people are involved and so on. And there are multiple ways of doing that. For example, another project that I'm working on, which is called Coloring Cities, and it's a project by my colleague Polly Hudson. It has a model where it has spread it in several countries around the world. It's about getting age data of buildings. And it's working independently. So there are people in each country who are it's an open source project, and people are running it from different countries. And that's also a kind of a beautiful, a business model that can be adopted, the open source method, which I fully support, by the way. It doesn't have to be proprietary and closed source and everything. So yeah, these are all valid points. I wish I had answers to that. I think my method is just carry on doing the work that I want to do in the project, and then see who is interested and how it's best to be developed, and move on slowly.
So interested people and investors, reach out to Flora.
Yeah. Yes, please.
But but kind of going very briefly back to give a little bit more context on the project you just mentioned before on these applications. So the formatting of the applications themselves is typically PDFs, so that's texts and images, and they need to be processed manually, I would assume, by these government bodies or by the, let's say, clerks or agents there. So to see how much an automation could be worth, maybe you have some numbers on how many applications actually in the UK or in London or so need to be processed per year, just to and I don't know how long it takes to process one of these applications, but maybe we can a little bit of math together here regarding let's say a business idea, right? And getting some funding.
Yeah, let's do it. Well, I'm looking for a partner, Matt. The UK is a very, very peculiar case because each council has their own way of accepting planning applications, which means that there's a huge variation in standards, in how these applications are formatted, what kind of elements they're required in each and every council in the UK. There are some efforts in kind of creating like this centralized repository or centralized planning method. Michael Batty's actually looking into that, has been looking for that for years, but it's still very fragmented. And if you download some of these applications, because luckily in the UK, you have this ability to go into each council and try to extract some of these applications, you'll notice that, as you said, there are practically large PDFs which contain forms with information about the development. And also they contain other PDFs which include plans. And these plans can be vectorized. So, for example, it could be AutoCAD drawings of floor plans or site sections and things like that. Or it can also be hand-drawn. So it could be people that have been doing sketches or letters with their handwriting. And also there's not like a clear format between these drawings. So it could be that some applications have all the drawings in one page and some others that have one drawing per PDF page. It could be that they have like different ways of representing the information in terms of, how installation is being represented or how. So there's a huge variation on how similar type of information is being thrown to each of these applications. More specifically, in the UK alone, there are about 3.5 million applications. So you can imagine the wealth of these.
That's per year, right?
That's per year. Yeah.
3.5 million applications per year.
Per year, yeah. That's a lot of applications. Yeah.
Imagine if it just takes, 10 minutes a pop. It's like 35 million minutes. I have no idea how many days this is.
Exactly.
And
It's estimated that it takes about 2 million man-hours to process these applications per year, which is a lot.
I think the investors are already convinced. And that's just the UK, right? Sure, there are some technical problems, but this is crazy, right?
Yeah.
This is crazy that during the phase of kind of the initiation of digitalization, in general, these things were not considered more.
Yeah, I think it's, again, it goes back to what we discussed in relation to communication between the different organizations and things like that. Especially in the UK, there's this thing where everything is very fragmented and there's a bit of difficulty in creating like a unified system that everybody exchange information flawlessly. I don't know how it is in the UK, in Switzerland. They are working towards that direction. And it's true that new applications are a bit more digitized, or there is this BIM standards now that are taking place, that they have enforced for public buildings, but not yet for residential. But even then, there's still issues to come across. And there's also the historical wealth that needs to be also read and translated somehow.
Yeah, even just scanning old documents. I mean, yeah, in Europe, the kind of city planning and this whole process is centuries old, right?
Exactly.
And a lot of the data still exists. Or I would assume most of the data is somewhere in an archive and on still, also hand-drawn, like 400 years ago.
Exactly, yeah.
It's
pretty insane.
So fascinating. But talking about business opportunities, right, and the connection between industry, academia, and government agencies, there's so much potential of improvement.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating. And to be honest, with all of these processes, I mean, I've seen a lot into those processes over the last few years, but it's astounding that not more people like yourself are working in this field and trying to push the envelope there.
I think there are people who are doing that systematically.
Yeah, but not much more.
Yeah.
There's so much to be done. There's so much potential.
There is, absolutely. I completely agree. And there's so many different fields that these needs to be applied to.
Sweet. Yeah, thanks for the examples of your work. I think this gives a lot of perspective on what this stuff actually means and how serious the work and research is that you're working on. So that's super inspiring.
That's very kind of you.
Now, I do have another question, kind of to go back very briefly to universities. And it's more a general question where I'm interested in your opinion. So worldwide, most universities are privatized or private institutions and thus must fundraise. There are different structures, but a lot of, let's say in the United States, the professorships or the chairs even sometimes have to, or very often have to fundraise for them, or maybe there's a bigger political body that does fundraising for the whole university. Versus, for example, here in Switzerland, a lot of the education, for example, is basically paid by the government and paid by the taxpayers, which makes it, I would say, a little bit less money-centric, the whole organization, and which I personally believe universities and research and so on, if this can or could be detached more from fundraising and from all the politics that are involved in bending of certain things, bending of research and so on, if those could be decoupled more, I would go for that. But, well, that's a system that there is. But which pros and which cons do you see for that privatized universities have to fundraise? Do you even see some pros, or do you see only cons?
Ooh, okay.
I'm just curious.
I think my political views are going to start being exposed here on this topic. But yeah, okay. So I came from a country where our universities were free and open, all of them, and it wasn't a perfect system on how you would get evaluated in order to get to your school, selected school, but it was a system that was equal for everybody. So it didn't matter if you have money or if you did not have money. It didn't matter if you are whoever you are, you went through a centralized system. You would get a certain score, and based on that score, you could go to whichever school you wanted to go if they would accept you based on your score. To me, I personally like this system. And the reason why I liked it was because, I didn't have to pay for it, and I don't have any student loans, which I think is incredibly important for the development of a person. B, my fellow students were very diverse, coming from very different backgrounds. I think that was really great. Thirdly, it also created a situation where our professors were more interested about actually teaching us and actually doing what their research they want to do, because their funding comes from a centralized base, rather than worrying about getting fundings all the time and proving that they bureaucracy and doing so. I believe that personally, I think that education should be free. Even if it doesn't necessarily lead you to a career that you want to, going through a university and getting this experience and learning about a particular topic is very valuable for your next steps, especially if it's done that way. The funding route that the UK is following now, and unfortunately they cut down on funding from the government more and more, and they're more depending on tuitions. I find it extremely restricting. It forces students to have, to go into loans, to reconsider taking courses. But on top of that, it also creates an atmosphere where the universities are run a bit like a business. And that's not how it's supposed to be. Universities are supposed to be about freedom of expression, be away from the capitalistic system, and function as a completely independent organization. I think this kind of commercialization of universities is definitely, and we can see that actually in kind of like there's a bit of a shift in traditional topics of universities or like research and so on, is definitely compromising a lot the freedom and the innovation of these organizations. I'm definitely against that. I don't think there's any benefit to privatizing universities other than getting more, I don't know. I don't find any benefit in that personally.
Yeah, thinking about it, I completely agree. And so, I mean, if I see, especially there are so many stories that you hear from the United States with students not being able to pay off their student debt pretty much for their whole career. This is bad, right? This is very bad. Your education should not be a burden, and also should not, knowing that it can be a burden, it should not prevent you from choosing to do a higher education because of the later on burden. And so if I were a parent living, for example, in the United States, I would actually very much consider sending my kids to study in somewhere in a country where the education is quote unquote free. Yeah. Because not only for saving this type of money for tuition, but also to have this incredibly rich experience of being exposed to sounds so negative, but to actually live in another culture, meeting other people, and that in itself is priceless, right?
I agree.
I was trying to figure out what are if there are some pros or if there are only cons, and I don't see many pros of this privatization in general. Just a few weeks ago, I saw an announcement where a university, I think it was in the Bronx, I might be wrong. I think the medical branch of that university got a huge grant. And for a full semester, all of the medical students got their tuition paid by this private, I think, donation or so. And there's a YouTube recording of that, how when this was announced in a large audience room, how absolutely bonkers the student went because of the joy. So it's really, really, really emotional to see what the impact of people that are going through these things, what the impact actually is. And
Definitely. Student loans should be legal, to be honest. I just think that people should just get scholarships instead of student loans. And they should not even like I strongly believe that education should be covered by the government, by the state,
or at least the one that you choose, and not you can kind of become an endless student and just jump between degrees because you never finish one. Maybe this would incentivize students to think a little bit harder in what they really want to go for in life.
Yeah, that's very true. Even though I don't see any issue with being like an eternal student personally. In Greece, they did introduce a law that said that if you're studying for over 10 years, something like that, then you're not eligible anymore for free education. That's one way of doing it.
Yeah, I don't think kind of lifelong learning in general should be something that is good, obviously, right? So, but just you need to also be a little bit mindful of the taxpayers that actually finance it. Right?
Oh yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
So that's more. I'm more coming from this angle. But if there would be ways where people could just study for the sake of studying, well, all good, right?
Definitely, yeah, that I agree. Again, but then again, my political opinions start to appear. But again, like I'm also of open universities. So nowadays we have the option of putting online content, something that I apply as well in my courses when I teach and so on. You can put online content, you can stream your lectures, you can have your doors open. In the architecture school, actually anyone could have just walked in and watched the lectures. It was it's so inspiring to be able to do that. And that should be an also goal for universities. It should be like, if there's a way to open the content and be available to as many people as possible, even better.
I completely agree. And I've seen many lectures online from different universities, like OpenCourseWare. So there's a ton that is, for example, available from MIT and Stanford. And it's just out there, it's public, right? And why should it need to pay for the same content? I don't know, hundreds of thousands of US dollars. You shouldn't have to pay for it, right? You shouldn't, right?
You shouldn't have to pay for it.
All right, no, we definitely agree on that. But I mean, the internet definitely helps with democratization of all of those aspects, and maybe this will have an impact on academia in general. And I will later on. I'll come back to this in a few minutes.
Perfect.
Piggybacking on this topic, how would you personally define the terms having a career and being successful? Just a side note here, I've spent quite some time over the last couple of months kind of just trying to find a definition of what do other people mean by those things. What do they mean when they say, I want to have a career, especially younger people, but then also on my own kind of agenda of constantly thinking that I am not successful at all. And then trying to track down what is the root of this constant self-doubt. And I'm really curious on how other people think about these things. I think I've found some solutions, but I'm curious about you, Flora.
It's interesting that you say that, because if you're not successful, then we're screwed. But no, I've also been having similar thoughts. And a lot of my colleagues as well, having spoken to them. I think it's a kind of curse of our generation that we redefine the terms success, we redefine the terms career, because we don't live in stable times anymore. It's no longer that you have one job that you keep for the rest of your life. Being successful doesn't necessarily mean a certain position. We see a lot of examples where there are people who have a huge impact and don't necessarily hold a certain type of, CEO or director or a professor or whatever that may be. And that's all because of how easily and accessible information is at the moment. I've also had very similar thoughts in terms of I haven't succeeded in kind of achieving what I would have wanted to have or whatever I had imagined. But then the way that I'm thinking about it nowadays is I'm trying to think of it in terms of the content that I produce, the work that I do. So what do I want to do? Like this XY project, like the planning application projects. Does this have a certain impact? And if it does have a certain impact, and I kind of think it's a good impact, then how can I work a bit more on it? How can I output something a bit better or something? And also another indicator that I think it's something that Elon Musk actually said, but I think it's really, really important is, what does it excite you to do when you wake up in the morning? So if you wake up in the morning and you say, okay, actually, what do I want to do? If you actually are able to do something like that, I think it's really really important. And there's another aspect as well to it. I think in our generation, we've also kind of learned we kind of overvalue this kind of hierarchy of the business world, and we kind of undervalue the very important work and jobs that are needed in our society. And I think we definitely need to reconsider this. And the new generation, I think, is definitely doing that. They definitely value more things like contribution to creating good things around you, or like even like the work of a mother, like raising their kid, or a nurse, or things like that. Which I think our generation was more like about, how we can produce more stuff, how can we be productive? This whole notion of production was very big to us. But I think it's definitely time to reconsider these notions. I'm trying to kind of, even with watching actually the new generation's videos and interactions, I'm kind of liking this whole redefine of success and the notion of success and how that leads to a bit more happiness in terms of what we actually do.
Yeah.
Something like that, I guess.
I agree. It took me a long time to think about those things and trying to find some answers for me. What I really found, there are 2 points that are really key, or were at least for me very much key, is kind of being aware of the individual elements and being able to kind of name them, and being able to separate the kind of the little topics that are floating around, laying everything out and kind of creating a mind map so you know what you're kind of trying to even dissect. And the other thing is to very, very consciously then look at each of those points and then start a very conscious process of separating your opinion of the view of other people to that thing, of other people's opinion that you think they have on you, or kind of the societal view. But then also the third thing, and I believe I was missing this one for a long time, kind of how do I see them personally? What is my nature, my personal nature actually, where do I personally want to go? So the main distinction is kind of the outside world of what you think the societal norm is regarding success, and completely detach this from your own view and say, no, I have different values and I'm defining my own values, but it needs to be very, very conscious. And to me, this wasn't long ago, but I think it was very, very important for me to also have a certain peace in these topics.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. It's something that I haven't been able to do entirely myself, to kind of do the separation between the outside and the inside. I think it takes a lot of work.
It does, yeah, it does. And you need to be very honest with yourself and just write these things down. And it's a process, but I can highly recommend it. It made me a lot more calmer and less anxious, I would say.
Sounds good. I'm wondering if, I've been recently looking into this also trend of wellness in terms of food, sleep. I mean, I think this guy. What's his name? Brian Johnson. Forgot about that. He's this multi-billionaire who has invested his entire life in stopping time.
I forgot the name. But yeah, I think it could be Brian Johnson.
Yeah. I'm wondering whether actually, fixing our diet and our sleep patterns and things like that may also help in calming us down in terms of these expectations.
I would say absolutely. I think this is completely underestimated also, the impact of, for example, the gut flora. Hello, Flora. And how it actually changes your personality. There's more and more research coming out that actually says that your character is not only kind of quote unquote stored or active just in your brain, but it's actually, there's kind of this bridge that is a connection between gut flora and the microorganisms in your gut and your brain. And this connection, if this is, for example, if you don't have everything functioning, this can have a huge negative impact. And so this can also be, I don't know, food allergies, or just in general that because of, I don't know, alcohol abuse or whichever types of abuse, you may have lost a lot of different types of cultures of these microbes, for example. You may develop severe anxiety and depression and all of those things. So I would say absolutely these things have a huge impact.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'm trying to implement some of these things myself. And I think one of the coolest things that I found is something about sugar spikes and glucose levels. Don't know if you heard of it. I don't know how we jumped from cities to that, but it can relate to how cities are healthy. So we can kind of link them up in terms of maybe urban agriculture later on. But there's this theory that says that you have to eat foods in a certain order, starting with fiber, so vegetables, then going to fats, healthy fats, then you go to proteins, meat and so on, and then you finish with starch. And this order changes your sugar spikes, and that makes you function much better for the rest of the day.
Some people will disagree because you mentioned meat, but yeah.
Yes, well, this can be, it could maybe not meat, but protein. Lentils, I guess. But that leads us to kind of another interesting question, which is how do we supply cities and the future cities with food, considering that agriculture and the meat industry has so much, it ruins forests with agriculture trying to take over forest land, the CO2 emissions, transferring goods, and all sorts of things. And I think this is a huge concept right now in our field in cities, is how do you actually, what do you do in terms of sustainability and climate, obviously climate change, in terms of managing this. Not to mention AI now and all these data centers that produce that require a lot of electricity and a lot of consumption of energy. So how do we actually manage to eat properly and sustain our population, increase our population without completely ruining everything?
And one of the first steps there would be to actually consume the stuff that was produced, especially food. Right? If you're looking at the statistics of that, for example, in the United States, 40% of the food is actually wasted and trashed because it wasn't consumed. I mean, 40%, it's insane, right? It's absolutely insane.
That is insane. I think this is where science of cities can actually help a lot, because optimizing what gets produced and where it goes, where it gets transported, is a very, very important issue. So I remember we worked on a project a while ago that was initiated by Cambridge University, and it was about an urban farm underground London. And it was this amazing farm that somebody had the idea of developing within a bunker of World War II. So it was like this huge tunnel underneath Clapham Junction that somebody decided to start planting vegetables in it. It was just a mad idea, but it was really cool because you could actually get like a whole farm underneath your house, if you think about it. Now, the weird thing about this whole thing is that, okay, that actually makes a lot of sense and whatever. It may require electricity, but they worked on methods and so on and systems and so on. What was weird about it is that he couldn't actually sell the products in the area he was in. So he actually had to transfer the salads that he was producing outside of London to sell them. And that was mad because of the whole how the industry is working. Because it's like, okay, if you can actually do that, then, you save on transport. That's the whole point. But what other forces are there out there to completely ruin that for you and actually make things even worse?
No, this is saddening, right? This is saddening.
Yeah. Yeah,
oh,
exactly.
Wow. But I mean, there's so much, potential and things still to be improved and to kind of also fix on this planet, right?
Yeah, definitely. By the way, we did like the 3D digital twin for this farm, and it was an open source project. So you can also find it and download the code and everything. And that was also really interesting because it would stream live feeds from all the sensors from the farm. People can optimize things and make sure that they don't get wasted, hopefully, in the future, if everything works okay.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Well, that was the perfect segue, kind of talking about 3D. So
yeah,
let's talk a little bit about 3D and 3D environments in general, because it's kind of the main topic of the podcast, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Your, at least PhD focus, but also heavily focus on your general work afterwards, was on kind of computing urban analytics in procedurally generated 3D cities, so kind of 3D cities that were code generated. Now, I wanted to ask, so comparing real GIS data, or so real city data, versus, let's say, artificially, procedurally generated, you could say, synthetic data, how do they differ from a point of, let's say, research? And what can be learned from fictional or synthetic data?
So the question is, what was the synthetic data versus real data? And what is the connection, or how?
So if you're comparing, let's say, real-world GIS data, I don't know, let's say OpenStreetMap data with building footprints, or you have the GIS data from a city, where you have transportation network, or all sorts of, let's say, urban data, but based on a real city. And now, having seen some of your earlier research from a few years ago, which you presented, where you're creating kind of synthetic environments with, you could say, lab-grown cities, or kind of master plans that were just generated within the computer, you could say. Maybe from an experience of being able to extract some analysis or insight, what were the main differences between working with these two types of data?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Yeah, so ever since I started working with 3D cities, I mostly was working on trying to recreate the existing cities, not imaginary ones, because I was working in the field of master planning. So my whole work was trying to find and dig data that I could use in order to rebuild like 3D cities. Originally realistically, then I kind of gave up on that idea. And then we can go through that later. And then also at the same time introduce the concept of how cities function within this 3D environment. Because as Le Corbusier said, form follows function. And cities are very much functional, organic elements. And if you are working as a master planner and you want to create 3D environments, you don't just want just visualization of these environments. You want to also be able to run simulations and understand a little bit about maybe how these cities may evolve in the next 10, 20, 50 years, and see how it visualizes. Now, in order to do that, you need to combine these two methods. You need to combine the actual data of the city in order to represent the current state of the city, but also you need to create some assumptions and some synthetic data in order to understand how these may evolve and create scenarios. And this is a very interesting combination between data analysis and design. This is an intersection between these two. And this is where I feel like the magic is happening. There are two issues there. First is a problem in translation between designers and engineers or data analysts. And secondly, there is this kind of fine line between what is possible and what is not possible. Mm-hmm. So the way to bridge this gap is to be able to work in two different, what we would call LODs. I would say in a different translation is to work on two different scales. Mm-hmm. One is the bottom-up approach, which is the data approach, is what kind of data I have and what kind of information can I get out of it. So I start with the data, I dig through the data and see what is there, and I work as a programmer. So I look into all the different details and create the functions, see what I can get out of it. And the other way is to look at the top-down vision, what I want to achieve is something like the line is something like a big concept, and then dig down to find the information, the data that will allow me to do that. Now, if these two collide properly, they can be really powerful. You can actually create some really interesting scenarios. But yeah, it's not straightforward to do. And it's part of this kind of research process that I'm very, very interested in.
I think this is super fascinating. I also kind of quite deliberately chose this question because it's right at the kind of pinpointing your type of research, and maybe I can have a short stab at it. So if you're looking at real city data, obviously you can say you extract some data and some statistics, and you can see kind of obviously you know how well it works in reality. But then if you're doing, for example, something like a master plan, it's kind of, you create these little scenarios that are also, you could say, temporal, just fictional environments. It's just synthetic data that you're using. And then you're trying to measure the impact on just this local region within a city. Kind of, does transportation improve? Can we have more inhabitants? Can we have a little bit more of a green zone? Can we improve the situation of having more schools and so on? But procedurally creating those, or with whichever tools, creating those little design scenarios, and then being able to compare the different scenarios with reality and improve just this little bit, just a local interaction within a city. This has been city planning and architecture and urban planning and all of those things for centuries. But I believe you're going much, much further with your work in trying to understand the system of systems. That is kind of the underlying working systems that are not only just regional interactions or regional changes or small changes in a city, but how does the whole system work on a city scale? And this is much, much more complicated, right?
Yeah, you're right. I think that part of my work was to understand a little bit of how little changes may have a kind of larger effect on the city. You can only understand that through looking into the science of cities, into how things interact with each other, what's the interdependencies between the different systems within a city. So, for example, let's say that people who travel to work, they live in a certain area and they travel to a certain area to work. Now, if we create a new development, such as a big airport, or if there's expansion to a big airport, that means that there are going to be more work places there. How will that affect housing supply? People may want to move there and work there closer because people obviously want to live relatively closer to where they work. So how does that affect the growth process of a city? This kind of science is a part of mathematicians and other scientists have worked on this area for many, many years ago. And there are different methods of understanding this. And procedural modeling is a technique that allows us to visualize this kind of dynamic systems because of its its dynamic properties. So because you can actually write rules to generate this environments very quickly, you can also integrate functional rules, such as how people travel and where they may choose to work, or what kind of retail places they may require, or what kind of schools that need to be around. Yeah, procedural modeling allowed me to inject this mathematical equations of analyzing and looking into these interdependencies into these 3D environments and being able to see how the city evolves in real time, how it changes based on these dynamic systems. Hope I'm explaining this relatively simply.
It makes sense. It's just I'm still, to this day, I'm still surprised that you can just take, let's say, some completely, not arbitrary, but you can use different approaches for planning at least parts of cities, studying focus areas that are completely, you could almost say randomizing master plans, but then you extract some statistics. You can measure the impact, like walkability analysis and all of those things, and then compare these, let's say, the fitness or the performance to the existing context. To me, this is mind-blowing because if you look out there, it's a physical world. There are buildings, there are streets, and yet still these very, very abstract tools allow us mathematically to describe such incredibly complex systems to a very, very high degree of precision. And because of that, obviously allows us to improve conditions in cities and lifestyle in general. To me, I'm just amazed by it. It may sound very abstract, but to me, just the whole urban planning process as a discipline is very, very astounding.
Yes, I completely agree. Again, it's slightly disconnected because, as you said before, people or data analysts or analysts who are doing these models are slightly disconnected from planners and the government. Mm-hmm. This is something that I think through visualizations such as City Engine or other platforms that can visualize these mathematical models, they're getting closer to kind of joining these disciplines and making people understand each other a little bit more. But yeah, I think it's fascinating. And as I think technology increases and we get more data about the urban environment and there are more models that analyze this, it's going to get more and more interesting to analyze livability, walkability, sustainability in cities.
And I mean, also here, we talked about kind of data standardization before. It's nowhere to be found, right? We are far from that.
Yeah, there's still work to be done in this aspect. There's definitely work to be done. I can't remember who was it, but there was a big governmental meeting and there was one particular person who kept talking about this, talking about standards and standards and standards. Nobody would listen to it. It was like, I don't think people understand the importance of kind of creating this kind of standardization in terms of looking into information.
Yeah, so kind of to go from that towards 3D in general, and in your research, what would you say were the hardest skills to learn for you?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think definitely coding. It was very difficult for me to transition from a design background to an semi-engineering world. I don't think that a lot of people understand how much pain it goes through learning how to code as a designer. I think there are some people who are naturally skilled in coding, and that's great. I'm not one of them, unfortunately. But yeah, I personally struggled a lot. And I think the reason is that, well, it requires a certain mathematical brain to be able to properly structure coding and write code. But also it requires a very specific, I think if you have a very good tutor or you go through a very good set of tutorials, you might have it better than others. If you start a bit complex and you don't learn the basics of writing code, especially structure of code, then I think from a design background, you may have it a bit rough. So personally struggled. I feel there's a kind of difference in how you think about things as a coder and how you think about things as a designer. And that's why also you tend to find people, especially in our industry, I feel like we find people who are either very, very good at coding or very, very good creatives. I think it's quite rare to find people who combine who are strong in both worlds. And I definitely think there's something about how the brain works that is related to that.
I agree, but also specifically in your field, it's not necessarily only that you have to kind of encapsulate something that is creative in code, but also the whole world of 3D data or 3D graphics in general also has a huge set of rules and limitations on how to interact with it, which is another very complex layer on top of the whole programming thing, because you need to obey those rules. And how do you extract the data from 3D models, and how do you get the analytical data, and how do you, I don't know, just a simple example, if you're just creating building volumes, how would you compute a walkability analysis for pedestrians? Because you need to find ways to kind of quote unquote model these types of data so you can actually extract the data. So there's all of this meta knowledge necessary to be able to do the research. But on the other hand, that in itself is also creativity, right?
Yes, that's a very interesting point. I had this conversation with a lot of my colleagues who are engineers/programmers, and we always run into an argument because they say that, yes, there is creativity within coding because you have to be creative enough to solve problems, which somehow makes sense. I, on the other hand, say, like, you're writing a bunch of code blocks. That is not creativity. That is nothing to do with imagination. Now that I've been working on both fields, I kind of get that, but I do feel strongly that it's a different type of creativity. It's a completely different type of creativity. And that is why most coders cannot draw. Right, they can't really produce a good drawing. There's a reason why this happens, or they don't. There's some of them who are very good musicians, though. I'll get into that afterwards. There's a reason for that as well. So I tend the way that I kind of experienced that is that when I was learning how to code, I struggled because I tried to see the whole code in my brain. So like I was like, I need to understand how this whole thing works, and then I couldn't break it down in points, and and that I think comes from my design background, where I start with we start with the vision, and then we start to kind of blocking it down to how do we actually break. But when you write code, it's not like that. It's not. Yes, you need to have a structure on how you'll code things, but you need to start very specifically. And write your functions and write your code blocks in a very, very bottom-up approach. So you have to very specifically start with small steps, the broken down steps, and start building it from the ground up. And to me, I really struggled to go from one. I realized that when I was working more as a coder, I started losing my creative abilities. I couldn't actually, it actually happened to me. I was like, I couldn't draw that well. I couldn't play well. I couldn't synthesize that well because synthesis requires abstraction. Coding is the opposite. You cannot be abstract in coding. So, yes, there is a certain type of creativity when you write code, which relates to how you actually solve problems. But it is not the same as the abstraction required to actually create a synthesis in a design level. And it definitely requires shifting between. I mean, I could easily visualize it between two brain parts, moving between two different brain parts, and I found that quite interesting. I definitely don't think I'm as a good coder, even now that I'm mostly working with code. I'm not as a good coder as I am a designer. I still don't feel that competent.
But luckily, these projects are so complicated and so large. The problems are so large that you actually need to have a team, right? Where you can take multiple people and allocate to the same problem.
I was going to say, and that's the beauty of these large-scale city projects, is that you need people from different backgrounds. You need to work with interdisciplinary, basically, and try to join these two people, but these different types of people. But yeah, I still struggle with, I think there's still a problem in communication. I mean, I struggle to communicate between these two parts of my brain. How about, different people with different expertise? So I think it's an issue that's ongoing in general.
Yeah. I mean, I see it day in, day out also within my own company's kind of operations, that to this absolutely necessary synchronization of breaking down creative workflows and workflow ideas, but then kind of pressing them in this very rigid form of code that just is not moving, and it has to compile, everything has to be absolutely correct down to the last semicolon, otherwise everything breaks. And I see the struggle, and of everything that you're describing, I see myself absolutely also in that.
As you said, I think it's likely that we can work with other people.
Well, you cannot have everything. You cannot be good in everything, right? It's just how it is.
But I think it's an interesting. So, how do you, when you are kind of between, because you're also between the creative, skills and the more coding. How do you find this inside of you? Do you struggle with it, or do you find that one complements the other in a way?
That's an interesting one. No, I mean, to a certain amount or to a certain degree, I have actually kind of passed on from trying to become a good developer or a good programmer, because I would never be able to master so many skills. It's just I've given up on that quite some time ago. But where I think I'm good is in intuition over the years. Just trying to analyze a process, whichever one it is. But then, and I had to learn this the hard way, basically. But being able to describe a process that manifests itself within me just as basically a gut feeling, as an intuition. And it's very interesting, but I do a lot of these things by just not actually thinking, but listening to my intuition. And then trying to break this down as basically a line of sequences, and then trying to make sure that I separate those pieces as a linear process, kind of, and then chop it up and talk about each individual piece and the connections to the next piece, and explain these things to the programmers so that they get both the big picture but also the individual technical challenges which I see. This is how it manifested itself with me, and for me, I'm not technical enough to solve everything myself, but over the years, in my experience, I was able to discuss the different problems, technical problems that we bumped into. I developed a very, very good intuition in knowing exactly where the pitfalls actually are and the bottlenecks, and being able to tell the programmers, be careful of this, be mindful of that. And so this is how I'm dealing with it. But breaking something creative down and then translate it into code myself, I struggle with this a lot to this day. Yeah.
Yeah, same here. I think that's a good way of pointing it, that it was really beneficial to go into coding, because you know exactly how to break the problem down and how to help other people solve it for you, basically, which is what I do as well now.
No, it's just to be aware or to have seen both sides also helps a lot in the interaction and management of a team. Right.
Totally.
Very cool. All right. So, hardest skill to learn, programming.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
But you also mentioned before we talked about the team or interaction with team or with other people, and kind of segueing there. So you have also been working on some public engagement initiatives and also engaging communities.
Yeah.
And can you share some information about that?
Sure. So I've done some public engagement during my PhD days. Specifically, it was a project. One of the first projects I was involved in was a project that was initiated by my PhD supervisor, Andrew Hudson-Smith, and the DPU department in UCL, who have done an amazing job engaging communities all around the world, and especially in Peru, for planning issues. And they had organized a very interesting mapping project in the outskirts of Lima, which was, well, at the time it was very innovative. Now it has been done, I think it was done by MIT. It was another project, but it's a similar idea where the project flew drones over the city of Lima and captured in 3D the environment there, especially in the area of the favelas in Lima, in Peru. What we try to do is try to map the infrastructure and the structures of the environment and develop a digital model of the area and engage with the communities in order to help them plan their environment better, because these are self-organizing communities. So the development planning unit in UCL, the project itself was led by Professor Andrian Allen, organized this mapping exercise with the local residents, where we went there, flew the drones, got the imagery, got the 3D model. They sat down with all the residents there and discussed their problems, mapped areas, mapped infrastructure, and created scenarios of how the city may evolve over time, what would be the priorities for this development. And our department focused a lot on developing this 3D visualization of the whole area, because it was hilly as well, and extracting data from this capture, such as the building structures, the road networks, where are the water elements, and different other elements that would be very useful in order to kind of have for these kind of, to make this kind of the further policy decisions. And I do think that the whole engagement process is a very, very important work that takes place in the planning process. It's not done enough, I think.
What do you say in this engaging communities in general, let's say public engagement? Is there, I mean, back then, I'm sure this was a super novel type of project in general on the planet, but especially for this region in Lima, which you mentioned. But would you say that public engagement in general, whether it is in a bigger city or in a more rural community, is this becoming more a thing? Is it appreciated by everybody, the public? Is there a tendency that it's getting more and more integrated in planning processes over the planet? Or would you say it's over time, I don't know, maybe people even kind of trying to give up a little bit on, in the sense of, in the whole context of also global politics, that people think they cannot influence anything?
That's a good question. I think it's so it changes over time, and it depends on circumstances, on people. I think what we call the local initiatives, like people's initiatives, are quite underestimated in terms of how much they can influence these kind of things. And I think that has been throughout history. I don't think that nowadays there's any particular change, at least from my understanding. I'm not too involved in the planning engagement processes, but from what I see, there's not a lot of change in making things better or worse. It hugely depends on initiatives. But there are some tools that have hugely improved how communities can engage with policymakers and how they can input information. And these are like purely digital tools, things like OpenStreetMap, or things like Coloring Cities, which is this project running at the Turing, which communities can input information about their buildings, or other open source communities, things just reporting issues on streets, or reporting. There was a project, can't remember which university was run by, but even using technology and sensors that communities were building to inform policymakers on floodings of rivers in their area and how this may affect their houses. These kind of initiatives are massively important for bringing out these voices.
So it seems that also kind of encouraging more of these engagements, specifically already kind of early on for, let's say, design decisions in general, is something that you are not only welcoming, but in general trying to push also forward. It's not only kind of city planning in general as the larger story arc of your work in general, but also to make it more accessible, to make it also more influenceable. Just so that people can interact with it.
Definitely, yeah. Especially in our kind of line of work in the digital twins now. What we are trying is to develop 3D visualizations or gamified versions of these complex systems in order for people to access them, understand them, and also create feedback loops. Comment on them or provide, play with scenarios and say what they prefer, what they don't prefer, what do they think is good, what's not good. I mean, there are definitely issues with this. There are certain biases that we need to be aware of that come from all these tools. There's certain accessibility issues, whether some parts of the community have access to it and others may not have access to it. So all of these are definitely issues, and privacy concerns are obviously. But I think that at the moment, even in the tech industry, there's a trend to try to kind of address these issues and move forward. So I think it's a positive way of moving forward, especially for the industry here and the kind of evolution of engagement in planning.
Yeah, and the whole accessibility to, let's say, just data in general via tablets and phones and so on also makes, plus obviously the developments in the 3D tools makes these processes even possible. But these are recent developments, quite recent developments, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But kind of digging a little bit deeper in city design in general, from maybe a research point of view, and this may be a little bit, I don't want to be ignorant, but I'm just curious. In city planning and academia in general, are we even focusing on the right and thus most urgent topics?
Very good question.
Kind of piggybacking on top of that, so kind of how do we find the right topics and how do we come to the conclusion that they are actually important?
That's an extremely important, very, very good question. I think the way of doing this is by asking the right questions, similarly to what you did, and also inquiring, constantly questioning whether we ask the right questions, whether we are actually asking the right questions. And nowadays,
it's a bit of a vicious circle, right?
It is, yeah, definitely.
So I don't want to be ignorant about these things, and I know, right? So we are moving forward with those things. It's just sometimes there's this nice saying of sometimes we don't see the forest because of all of the trees. And with all of the topics, like also, for example, the climate change and the energy crisis and all of those things, kind of sometimes it's really hard to say, are we on the right track? Because we're too busy to ask the right questions. Is that something that you have been confronted to in research or in some of the concrete projects that you've seen yourself in your professional and academic work? Or are you aware of that there's, I don't know, even literature addressing this topic?
I'm pretty sure there is. I haven't really done any research on it, but I'm pretty sure there is. Definitely, I have encountered it myself. But having worked in a few organizations now, academia, research, nonprofit organizations, and the industry, my impression is that, and that comes from a very subjective view, though, so I may be entirely wrong, but my impression is that the questions themselves don't come from the right incentives sometimes. And that can hinder the development of research and other projects. So, for example, let's say that we're all talking about climate change now and how we need to prioritize this particular field and topic, right? So one of the questions would be, for example, how do we actually decarbonize buildings? Buildings are a huge cause of producing CO2. How do we actually decarbonize? How do we make them more efficient? So we have this challenge, right? How do we decarbonize buildings? There could be wrong incentives because it could be that, for example, a certain organization may receive a lot of funding because they claim that they're going to do a lot of things about climate change, and their business proposal, business model, or their strategy links to that. But in reality, they may just do this on a very superficial level, and we've seen that a lot of times. The actual outcome of the research or of the work may be kind of counterproductive, or may not actually relate too much with actually developing these kind of systems. But I think, so the incentives themselves may not be so much about, okay, how do I actually solve a problem such as decarbonizing buildings? But it actually may be more like, how do we actually get more funding in order to sustain our business for the next 10 years and then try to make up something around it in order to tick all the boxes that we need.
Which is very typical human behavior, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and how do we ask the right questions? I don't know. That's a very good question. How do we actually find the right questions to ask?
Is it even possible? I do not know. I really don't know.
I don't know either.
I mean, if you want to have a certain amount of impact of improving things, you need to start somewhere. And if you say, okay, what are the right questions? This in itself is an open-ended question. So by trying to answer that, you will never start with anything, right? And then obviously also the whole impact which you described on political processes, and political in the sense of also business processes that kind of sidetrack everything for whichever reasons, prevent progress in general. But all of these things, they seem to be human problems again, right?
Yeah. And that reminds me a little bit, your question also reminded me a little bit to the Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy, where they, they ask, what is the meaning of life? And they're trying to find the solution. What's the meaning of life? And then they run up to the supercomputer and it goes 42, which is the famous 42 answer. So it's what is actually the right question so that you can actually get the right answer? I don't know. I guess the only way of doing this is to ask constant questions and constantly ask things, like Socrates would say. I mean, philosophy may actually be a good way of... It's something that's, again, it's very undervalued, learning philosophy. Maybe we should focus a little bit more about, in kind of reading more about how, great philosophers actually formulated questions around life and what is valuable and what's not valuable. I remember there is a beautiful extract by Plato. So I don't know if you've read The Republic, but the whole Republic, which is a book about how is an ideal city, right, starts with one question. It's quite interesting. So there's a whole book where Socrates discusses about what makes an ideal city, and Plato formulates this whole notion of philosophers being on top and so on. The whole thing starts with one question. The question is, so Socrates goes to a very rich friend of his who's very old, and the question that he asks him is, do you think that money brings happiness in old age? This is the question that triggers the whole discussion about what's an ideal city. And why does it trigger it? Because his rich friend, I think his name was Cephalus, replies with, well, if you are a good character, money can bring happiness in your old age. If you're a bad character, it doesn't. And then Socrates goes on to ask, what is a good character? And that leads to the question of who is actually a just man, because according to Cephalus, he said, the kind person is the just person. Who is a just man? And that leads to the question of what creates a just man? What kind of society creates a just man? What does it mean? And is that needed or not needed? And that triggers a whole discussion around what would be an ideal city. And how beautiful is that this kind of very different question actually opened up this kind of conversation.
Yeah, and it's also completely kind of recursive and perpetual, because only a good living environment, kind of the ideal city, even enables people to develop, as people usually say, their best version of themselves, right?
Yes, and that's exactly what Socrates believed in. He believed that actually only good people can create good cities, and bad people may gain in the short run, but in the long run, they create bad communities, which is not going to benefit them as well.
And there are countless examples of that on the planet, obviously, right? And exactly, I mean, you feel a lot of philosophy in my questions. I love these topics. They may sound usually a little bit, let's say, pessimistic, but it's exactly this reflection of where are we coming from, where are we going, and how can we sometimes also leave this world a better place later on. So I think these are really, really important things to talk about. And it's not easy. It takes a lot of energy. And I mean, we've been talking for about 2 hours now already, right? It does take some energy. And I do have it. You seem to have it too. And you're doing fine.
I try to.
But yeah, I think exactly what is a good human being trying to bring some value to good cities, to good societies, and so on. It's not effortless. It takes a lot of energy and the right reflections on the right types of questions.
Absolutely.
This is why I try to bring up these questions that I know there's not a right answer. That's kind of also a sad reality. Yeah, and then, I mean, kind of also seeing that, I just have a note here, right? Based on these findings of kind of urban design research and its applications on other cities on the planet, right? It would be really nice if we would find, let's say, a mathematical structure that helps us design perfect cities and a perfect society, and we would be able to apply this to other cities and other countries and continents. It's just not that easy, right?
It's definitely not that easy. I'm not sure. Our society is definitely not perfect. So I'm not sure if we could even, if there's any point to finding that. But this guy that I've mentioned before, who's trying to keep himself young, he's also posed an interesting question, which applies to what you're saying, which is, if you could have an algorithm for yourself that you would, though, have to follow religiously every single day, but would guarantee that you would have great physical and mental health, but you would have to follow it every day religiously, would you actually follow that algorithm? Mm-hmm. I think there's something there, because on one hand, yes, why not? You'd be happy. But on the other hand, doesn't suffering and maybe mistakes and maybe issues create more innovation, create more happy accidents, as Bob Ross would call it, or like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Does it hinder creativity, maybe, this algorithm, and freedom?
Yeah. And I mean, in the sense of who wants to live forever if life is boring, right? Yeah,
in a way. Or if you're not free somehow. Mm-hmm. So maybe like a perfect algorithm for cities. Not sure if that would be a necessarily good thing. Maybe yes, maybe no.
Yeah, who knows? Well, we got sidetracked again a little bit, but I think for me, at least, it's really important to address those topics, to kind of remind myself to what is it that I really want to work on, which types of problems, and why are they keeping to motivate me every morning that I'm getting up, right? I mean, we're more focusing on creating fictional environments, a little bit more for the entertainment and visual aspects. But still, the motivation behind it is still to provide some value to people, whether this is in the sense of a bit of good entertainment, better lifestyle, things to reflect on in general, or whether it is better cities. We're all kind of in the same boat in the sense of that we're just trying to strive for things that, or most of us at least, that eventually will have a positive social impact, kind of as a long-term goal.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So based on your experience on both real-world and fictional 3D city design, can you give us a few tips and tricks of what 3D artists in the creative industries that don't have your skill set should look out for to make their city designs more realistic?
Oh, okay. Interesting. Well, coming from a master planning background again, I don't know if they would want to do something like that, but I think taking into consideration the function of the city is something really important. So it's not, what is a city, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a collection of buildings? Is it a collection of people? Is it a complex system? I think most 3D artists usually tend to visualize buildings and street networks that resemble a city. And that could be fine for what they want to do. I guess if they want to go a step further, they should also start thinking a little bit about the function behind the form. So where do people live and what kind of things do they need around them? Maybe introducing some of the science of cities would be interesting in the next iterations of the designs. It may yield some different results in terms of visualization. I sometimes can see that in some imaginary cities that I find interesting. Like, these guys didn't actually do this properly. It's a lot of dead ends there, here and there, or something like that.
Nice. All right. Everybody listen up to the pro here. Nice. All right. Let's look a little bit into the future. So how do you see as a society, obviously also always thinking about the city and our environment, how do you see our future in general now in a time where, for example, just short ago, Sam Altman, OpenAI's Sam Altman, mentioned that the next version of GPT or GPT-5 will eliminate 100 million jobs.
Oh, I'm so looking forward to that. And I'm not just joking. I think it's great.
Wow, bold statement.
I mean, to be honest, I don't know. Personally, I think that I don't think is. I mean, look at the Industrial Revolution, right? I mean, it did cost some jobs, obviously, but new jobs were created. And coming from a background where I actually lived through the Greek crisis, financial crisis, where a lot of jobs were cut at the time. I think it's very important for people, even if you lose your job because of AI or so on. Things move so fast nowadays, and they change so fast that even if there's a rough couple of years or whatever that may happen through the economy, something else is going to happen. Something else is going to pop up. And I believe that at the moment, AI creates much more opportunities than hinders them. So that is my take on this. I'm a bit optimistic, to be honest. Yeah, I'm not pessimistic. I do think that it's dangerous for other reasons. But in terms of how it's going to help us in the future to streamline our work, to focus on more important things, I think I'm towards the optimistic.
I love it. I love it because I'm constantly kind of battling with myself. Is it good? Yes, I do see the good things, but I also see how, I've watched a lot of very dystopian movies, so I know kind of which future we don't want to have. But I love the fact that you're looking at these things positively, right? And kind of this little funny anecdote is you can see the glass half empty or half full, as being the optimist or the pessimist. But you know what? In reality, it's always full because the rest is just air.
Exactly. It's just
Right.
about seeing things from just looking at the things that you wouldn't think of normally, thinking out of the norm.
Exactly. So I this is something that I personally I need to learn a little bit more of, always seeing the positive side. But kind of staying on this topic also for a little bit. So in your research, did you study the impact of a post-AI society on the infrastructure of cities?
Right, yeah. A little bit. So there's different trends that go on within this field. One of them is the self-driving cars and how will that affect the infrastructure of the city. There's a very nice project by BIG who envisioned this roadless cities where cars would be able to run through highways, but also, actually there are no highways. They would be able to just go around these systems of networks of types of segments of infrastructure that they just go within skyscrapers and things like that. Then there is the other aspect of energy and how cities will be able to get their energy from. So post-AI, what does it mean to have renewable energy and the issue with the batteries and storing of energy? Then there is the whole issue with privacy and security in terms of monitoring. That's a huge issue in post-AI futures. So we will have more and more sensors, cameras, but also other types of sensors that will monitor our every move in order to optimize energy, optimize whatever that may be. How do we make sure that we don't run into this black mirror futures where people are scored or monitored or identified? This is a huge part of AI futures. How do you actually maintain the privacy of your citizenship and maintain their freedom? Yeah, so I've looked briefly a little bit into these items. One of the things that I've personally worked on, which I think is funny, is not that important or impactful, but I do think it's funny. So I worked briefly on a project in the British Library and the Alan Turing Institute on libraries and the future of libraries. And that's an interesting topic because what is the function of libraries in a post-AI future where you have everything digitized? That's actually...
Good question. Yeah, very good question.
Right. Yeah. And also, what's the use of books and things like that, which I think is, especially in the sector of librarians, they're very, very keen on kind of finding solutions to this. And one of my findings was that actually libraries are very, very important for post-COVID period. And they should probably look more into that, because what my research showed is that during COVID time, where people wanted to work more remotely, had to work remotely. And also as we change post-COVID, we change habits and we're working remotely. But what the research showed is also that people, they want to work remotely, but they don't necessarily want to work from their houses. They don't want to work where they have a lot of distractions and so on. So either they go to cafes or something like that, or they go to co-working spaces and so on. But libraries is also a big, big target of people who want to work remotely. And libraries could change their facilities in order to facilitate that. The British Library, for example, has done a really good job doing that. But, local libraries as well, there's an opportunity like post-AI into kind of looking into what it means to not have traditional working spaces, but also maintaining the sense of community in working environment and working with other people. So yeah, that was my post-AI future of cities project. We're focused on libraries.
That's super interesting because it is about social connections again, and it is about space. And the use of space, ultimately, which is, you could say, a city organizational aspect, the meeting places, and also how this changes over time. for multiple ever-changing reasons also. So that's, very, very cool example on that.
Oh, yeah. The change of uses in cities is going to be a very huge thing, I think, in the future.
And another post-COVID thing is also that within, let's say, kind of downtown or in this business districts of a lot of larger cities, there's now a lot of more office space available because it couldn't get rented out again.
Yeah. That's very true. It's coming back slightly now, but yes, it's true that especially in London, there's a lot of conversion of office spaces to residential. And one example is the tower in Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street, which is a very central tower that they've converted entirely from office spaces to residential and housing. I think we're going to see that happening.
Which is fantastic, so that people can actually have more, especially in such large cities as London, for example, that there's affordable housing or apartments, again, within the city centre, which is, or hopefully it is affordable, or there's a tendency to make it affordable again.
Yeah, definitely. A question that I would have for you is, do you think that this change, how do you think this change will reflect into the 3D environment? Is there any point in maybe depicting this kind of changes within the 3D environment that you're working on? Like, for example, these changes of population or geodemographics or uses within 3D environment, or is it just about the building envelope?
I mean, in our case, it's just about the building envelope, but I think the topic itself as a story that could be told, that in itself is very, very interesting. And so I've been involved in this one project called Utopian Disruption that basically one of my staff did together with a researcher from the Ideal Spaces Working Group about a year ago, where they basically together designed you could say utopian ideal city together as a system or as an aggregation of form and function to make a sustainable city. And as part of, let's say, projects like that, or changing parts of a city to become more sustainable, I think these are kind of these interventions in cities. These are highly, highly important topics or aspects also of a city being you could say, a living organism that just needs to be able to stay changeable, which is in itself a very, very fundamental aspect that needs to be considered in the planning of the future city, so that we don't know what the perfect situation is, even at the moment, but we just know that the only constants in the universe is change, right? So that a system will need to be able to change even later on. And so kind of regarding whether we would be able to visualize this or whether this is at the moment something that we are dealing with in our 3D work, I would say not at the moment, but the topic is in the context of where are we going with cities, absolutely crucial. It's a crucial topic. Yeah.
Definitely.
Now, you just mentioned the kind of the library before, and I just want to, I'm really curious about this. This one next question is, how do you see academia and education in general evolve in the near future, also considering technology such as Neuralink?
I think it will depend on the evolution of AI, how fast we can reach what they call a general AI, which is kind of like understanding more complex. Because at the moment, AI is very, very good at doing very specialized things, such as playing chess, but is not yet quite great at doing things that we think are very tedious, such as driving a car. But so the things that require a lot of synthesis and a lot of composition. So we're still required for that bit.
Luckily.
So even if we can download information, the ability to make connections and to kind of allow you to come up with your own problems, come out with your own questions, is still something that's very much human at the moment, at least. Kind of. Well, to be fair, I don't know how far we are until that point that we get replaced on that as well. But in terms of education, though, I think this is a very serious question, because it is true that the information is now available. So why do you need universities, or why do you need schools for that matter? I think that there's one aspect of the educational system which is about socializing, which you can't get by downloading information in your brain, and socializing with peers that have not only similar interests, but you're working on problems that are common because you're given similar topics to research. So there's something about that you can't download to your brain. And I think it's very, very valuable. I very much value the time that I spend with my colleagues and my professors working on my projects, and the kind of the melting pot of ideas that happen during that time. But also, having said that, we're going to go back to our earlier discussion that I believe that should be free and not necessarily and open. You definitely need to kind of have some funding related, maybe from the government, to pay the actual teaching stuff and the equipment or the space that you're doing these kind of activities in. In terms of knowledge, to be honest, I think everything is accessible now. I doubt that there's something that you can't really access. So the only thing that I think will remain in the futures is this part of getting together and with people with similar mindsets, with time in their hands, with the ability to kind of answer specific questions that are kind of also maybe given to you, be creative around that. And I think there's also another point now that I think about it, though. I remember hearing some Altman or somebody else who was in that field who have also started PhDs and they just didn't finish them. And I think one of the key things that they mentioned is not so much about being there and receiving knowledge, it's about the screening process of these universities. So how do they select the people? And then these people get together in an area and they're given this sort of means to, I don't know if that's something that AI will be doing as well in the future. So the screening process and kind of bringing these people together and kind of offering them these tools. But that's something that at the moment can't be replaced.
Interesting. Nice. All right. Before slowly wrapping up, let's push a little bit towards the arts.
Okay.
You're also organizing an arts event. Can you share a little bit more information on that?
So I think you're referring to the AI and arts interest group that I've mentioned before.
Yes.
Well, in the Alan Turing Institute, which is the National Centre for Artificial Intelligence in the UK, we have started an interest group which is called AI and Arts. It focuses on bringing together people from the art sectors that are interested in AI and kind of linking academics and professionals with different backgrounds on these topics. It's still early. We have certain events. We have webinars happening. So if anybody's interested in AI and arts, you can Google AI and arts at the Alan Turing Institute. You can become a member, sign up as a member, and then you can get access to our Slack channel with AI and arts professionals, events or that are happening mostly in the UK, but also in other places around the world. And also webinars and other stuff that are going to happen that I'm not allowed to say yet, that are in the works. It's I'm involved in it more from my kind of like artistic background than my engineering background. At the moment, it is more like a melting pot of kind of trying to define the sector and go beyond the generation of images using Midjourney or now ChatGPT-4 or whatever that may be. So what does AI mean for the arts and what does art mean for AI is the main questions that we pose in this group. There are several projects running from different people. They're posted in our blog, AI and Arts at the Turing, in Medium. Yeah, we're still kind of starting off at the moment, but I think it's a very interesting sector because, as we mentioned before, there's a gap between design and engineering. And especially I've seen that at the Alan Turing Institute where I used to work. There was a arts and humanity section, but it was very underdeveloped. There was not a lot of funding. It was more about security, privacy, health, the big challenges. And art was somehow in the poor brother there somewhere in the corner. Nobody cared that much about it. But it is, I think, there is a very serious question about what is art in the age of AI, and how can art contribute to this AI explosion development. And I think it all comes down to this philosophical questions.
Yeah,
this is what art always did.
Yep.
So yeah, if you're interested in discussing these philosophical topics, then I would recommend joining us. It's a very open group.
We'll post the links in the podcast episode description for
cool.
sure.
Great.
All right, next art question. If you'd write a book or create a game or direct a movie or something like that, what would it be about?
Ooh, I'm already writing a book. I can't say much about it.
Aw.
I can't say much about it, but I have to say it'll be on cities, obviously. It's my passion. It's something that I've been working on for ages. It's not so much on 3D environments, surprisingly. There's a bit of that. But definitely on cities. Yeah, and I also have another book which I can't talk about. It's not so much by me, it's by my colleague Richard Milton, but I will be contributing. It's on drones, because we have created this, I think it's a very cute project with engaging students, especially from schools around the UK. And it's kind of, we're trying to show them how they can use drones for good. This workshop has been running for over 6 years now with the Department of Engineering at UCL as well and CASA, with a lot of success. We're going to be involved in the Festival of Engineering, where we're going to be presenting. I think it's an open festival as well, so people can see a little bit and learn about how to make an actual drone. And we're kind of developing a book on around this kind of idea of how do you use drones for good? How do you make drones, and how do students can create their own drones and fly them and do different things?
That's so awesome. There's so many things going on with your work. That's super cool.
I know.
So for people that are interested, where can people find more about your work?
Google. I don't have a website, which is something I've been called upon for ages. I think maybe Google would be the best way. I'm not very active in LinkedIn, sadly. Not at all.
All good. Saves you a lot of time.
But yeah,
nice.
Google.
Perfect. That's perfect. Cool. Let's dive into the last couple of questions that I always ask. So, and kind of, I get it with this one, I think I already have the answer. So if you would have to recommend one book everybody should read, which one is it and why? So, I mean, you implied there's your own book, your friend's book, but maybe we can go one beyond that.
I'm kind of jiggling, here in the background, because I really, really like this question. And not just because I'm going to talk about movies as well, because movies are my passion. So if you don't mind, I will suggest a movie as well. So book, my personal favorite, and I think that everybody should read it. Beyond Plato, The Republic, which I think everyone should read it. It's also, obviously a classic one. Aldus Huxley, Brave New World. It's one of my favorite books. For a more specialized audience, I would also recommend by Constantinos Doxiadis, who was a planner in the 40s. And it's called Anthropopolis, the City of Human Development. And is around how do we actually create a science for designing cities. He was a very big master planner. He was involved in the design of several cities in Pakistan and in the US, in Greece. And he has done some very interesting work in the philosophy of the science of the cities. So that's something I would recommend as something more specialized. He's also coined the term entopia, which is what I've put my nickname in Twitter.
Ah, that's
entopia.
where this is from.
Yeah.
Nice.
And what it means is that people don't need utopia, because that's something that relates to our 3D discussion as well. But what they need is entopia, so in the inside of the topos, the in topos, something that is in place. So that's where it comes from. And then there's several other books that I would recommend, but I think these are the main ones.
You can send me the list and I'll also add it in the description. So no problem with that.
I can send a reading list for sure. But also, can we talk about movies? So I really wasn't just
Sure.
Okay, so obviously Metropolis is one of them by Fritz Lang, which kind of shows the post-industrial era in a very interesting way.
Classic, yeah.
Classic, yep. And then I would suggest, oh my God, my mind is blocked now. Okay, I'll get back to that another time. I don't know why.
All good. Also for that, you can also send a list and I'll include it.
I'll add
movies is absolutely endless. All good.
How many? Yeah, I mean, from 20 Days Later to, I don't know, to Space Odyssey to whatever.
This is absolutely endless. But maybe send me the top 3 afterwards.
I'll send you the top 3, yes. Put them in the list.
Nice. Then if you could change one thing on this planet to make it a better place, what would it be?
One thing?
Just one thing, not a list.
Well, I'm tempted to say the obvious, which is politicians. But to be honest, I think the right answer to that would be, going back to the philosophy, it would be to filter better the unjust people. I think that's what I would probably change. People who are bad for the community and for the world in general, to filter them better and kind of manage them better. I think that's what I'd like to change at the moment. And that includes like people in leadership positions as well. Things like that.
I get what you mean. I think we all do. Nice.
And I think that relates to our value system a little bit.
Yeah, it is a tricky one, but I don't have an answer either. I guess nobody has, but I do precisely get the point.
Yeah. Maybe to value money less, maybe something like that.
Is a huge factor.
Yeah, I think so. I think that would change a lot of stuff. Maybe Plato's idea about the philosophers not being paid may actually bring a lot of changes to our world.
Yeah. Thinking about that, kind of, if AI would have a good potential, then it maybe could be a world that doesn't need a currency or money anymore. I'm not sure what the implications would be on that, but maybe we can discuss this in the next episode.
Yeah, that's a whole PhD topic. That would be very interesting.
That's an interesting one.
That's a very interesting one.
All right, but last question for today. Who would you like to see as a guest on the 3D Environment podcast?
Oh, a lot of people that come to my mind. You've already brought quite a lot of cool people, actually.
Thank you. We're just getting started here.
Okay, so shall I say names or shall I say generally? I would say generally, and then, because I don't want to name specific people, but I think some people from the Disney engineering is some people I'd like to see in your podcast. Or research, Disney research or something like that. Then there are some people from academia in the 3D environment sector. There's some really good work done in both in CASA, in the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis, but also in the Energy Institute, where they're developing a 3D stock model. But also in Newcastle, We're building some really cool stuff with the Urban Observatory, in the Norman Foster Foundation that I'm in as well now. There's some stuff down there. So I'd love to see some of your guests being from purely architectural background as well. It'd be interesting. And one person that I could name, because I don't know them personally, but I would love to hear his opinion on the matter, is Lev Manovich, who I really like his work on augmented reality stuff. He's a very interesting person. He's written a lot of articles on the philosophy of AI, but also cultural analytics and generative art. So I think he's an interesting person to have. And he has done a very nice paper on augmented reality and new media.
That's interesting. Yeah. Just definitely send me this link. I'll have a look. Yeah. There's reaching out to more and more people, and my network is growing so fast. I could easily do a podcast every week. Zero problem with that. It's just I'll get there with my time management. I'll get there. Maybe an AI can help me.
I was gonna say, I think that in the future it'll be easier.
That's one of the good things, right? Technology. Use technology wisely to get rid of some of the grunt work.
Exactly. That's where I'm betting on.
Yeah.
That's where my optimism come from.
The glass is, as we have seen, is always completely full, right?
Exactly.
All right. Well, this is it from my long list of questions for you, Flora. Are there any last things from your end?
Well, thank you very much, Matt. I really had a great time. And even though this is my first podcast, I hope it just, I didn't lag too much on the microphone, which I seem to be doing a lot. Yeah, no, I think it was great. I'm looking forward for the next podcast that you're going to do, to more discussion involving the 3D environment and the future of the city.
Thank you so much. And also from my side, it's been an absolute pleasure and honor to have you on as a guest. And it's been very, very inspiring for me. And these topics, especially everything that is philosophical, right? It's hard to process it, and it needs a little bit of time to crunch through everything and to be able to, at least also in my case, to even be able to articulate all of those topics and the thoughts and so on. But it's a dialogue worth having.
Definitely.
So thank you for all of the time that you have invested today.
Thank you.
And I would say, have a lovely rest of the evening.
You too. See you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Cheers.
Bye.